Shalom, everybody. Welcome. It is Thursday, June 4th, and here in Massachusetts, it feels like summer, finally. The sun is shining and uh, and it's nice and warm, and I hope you're warm and safe and comfortable wherever you are today. And it's a pleasure to be with you in our continuing conversation about Israel's journey through the wilderness. And a couple of observations about where we are. First of all, if you're a regular synagogue goer, you know that it's the time of the year that in synagogue life we're reading the books from Bemidbar, and so it's kind of cool. It kind of brings back to me all the places that we've been over the past 2 years that we've been doing this, studying the book of Numbers, and then hearing it read out loud in the synagogue at this time of the year, and even having people stand up and give their Devar Torahs. And it brings me back to study that we've done in the past. And maybe a little bit of retrospect and even nostalgia is appropriate for the section that we turn to today, because we're going to be taking a look at Numbers chapter 33. And there's definitely a feeling of summing up and things coming to a conclusion. The big theme of Numbers chapter 33, Numbers chapter 33, among other things, opens the final weekly Torah portion of the book of Numbers, Parshat Maseh. And the chapter that we're going to occupy ourselves with today is, I think, one of the predominant feelings is nostalgia, that Moses takes a look at where we've been for 40 years. Piece by piece, the itinerary of all the places we stopped, the passage really feels like the beginning of an end, so to speak, a summary of all the places we begin. That said, we're going to try to mine some of the emotion and the depth to this passage because, on the other hand, it feels very formulaic and straightforward. You might ask the question, why is the Torah hocking us with all of this? Because what chapter 33 of Numbers does, we'll look at it in a moment, it unfolds step by step in the 42 different stations that Israel stopped and encamped at over the 40 years of wandering in the desert wilderness between the exodus from Egypt and the arrival and entry into the promised land. It starts, the itinerary starts back in that Egyptian city with a very Egyptian name called Ramses, the place, the storehouse that presumably the slaves built for Pharaoh. And it goes step by step to all these places that we visited, up until the present moment where Moses is speaking on the encampment on the eastern side of the Jordan River. Let's take a look at the text. Here it comes. There is a lot of emotion going on here, at least as far as the commentaries and the Midrash find, for a text that in itself seems very, very dry. Watch this. And I'll do the reading, I think, because of so many of the place names. But the chapter begins with a nice introduction. An introduction that says, this is the beginning of the end. I like that phrase. Ele maseh b'nei Yisrael asher yat'u me'eretz Mitzrayim letzivotam. These were the marches of the Israelites who started out from the land of Egypt, troop by troop, in the charge of Moses and Aaron. Moses recorded the starting points of the various marches as directed by God. Their marches starting points were as follows. That's a little bit of a convoluted verse. We'll get to that in about 40 minutes or so, I think. They set out from Ramses in the first month, on the 15th day of the first month. Remember that? Passover wasn't that long ago, right? On the 15th day of the first month, Passover. It was on the morrow of the Passover offering that the Israelites started out defiantly, in plain view of all the Egyptians. The Egyptians, meanwhile, were burying those among whom God had struck down every firstborn, whereby God executed judgment on their gods, the 10th of the 10 plagues. And with that introduction, now we go. The Israelites set out from Ramses and encamped at Sukkot. They set out from Sukkot and encamped at Etam on the edge of the wilderness. They set out from Etam and turned towards Pi. I'm going back and forth between Hebrew and English. Pi Hachirot, which faces Baal Tzafon, and they encamped before Migdol. Then they set out from Pnei Hachirot. There seems to be a little bit of discrepancy by what the name of that place was. And they passed through the sea to the wilderness, and they made a 3 days journey in the wilderness of Etam and camped at Marah. Then they set out from Marah and came to Elim. There were 12 springs in Elim and 70 palm trees, so they encamped there. They set out from Elim and camped by the Sea of Reeds. They set out from the Sea of Reeds and encamped by the wilderness of Sin. They set out from the wilderness of Sin and encamped at Dovka. And they set out from Dovka and camped at Alush. And they set out from Alush and encamped at Rephidim. It was there that the people had no water to drink. They set out from Rephidim and encamped in the wilderness of Sinai. They set out from the wilderness of Sinai and camped at Kivrot Tava. And they set out from Kivrot Tava and encamped at Hatzerot. And they set out from Hatzerot and encamped at Ritma. Everybody get the idea? Should I read the whole section? Or you get the You want to read the whole section? Go to shul in about 6 weeks or so, and somebody will read this part of the Torah word for word. But it goes on and on and on for 49 verses and gets to the culmination of all of this. They set out from the hills of Abarim and encamped at the steppes of Moab, at the Jordan near Jericho, and camped by the Jordan from Beit Yeshimot as far as Avel Shittim in the steppes of Moab, which brings us up to where we are right now. Presumably, Moses is speaking to them from these hills of Moab, which is the end of the road for Moses, at least, because by the end, we know he'll die and his student Joshua will lead the Israelites into the promised land. 49 verses. Let me take it down for a second. On one hand, we're going to mine this for meaning. On the other hand, on the surface, not the most invigorating, exciting part of the whole Torah, I imagine. Just to understand this itinerary that the text lays out for us, here's a few handy-dandy visuals for us. First of all, I got this from Jacob Milgrom and his masterful commentary. He describes the structure of this chapter for us. After the first couple of introductory verses, here's the itinerary. It's in 3 parts. The verses 5 through 15 talk about the movement from Ramses, the slave city that they built at the Passover, to the arrival at Mount Sinai where we received the Torah. That seems like a good unit in and of itself. The second third is the movement from Sinai to Kadesh, which takes us verses 16 to 36. What happened at Kadesh? Very important for our studies, and we've talked about it before. Kadesh is the place in Numbers chapter 13 where the story of the spies unfolded. So Kadesh itself is on the border of the promised land. We might have thought that that would have been the end of the story, and we would have had to study some different sort of Torah over these past 2 years. But no, that was the story where the spies went in, they came back, gave their negative report. The people lost all faith and confidence and hope. And God said, all right, I'm turning this car around, everybody back into the desert. And 40 years from now, when this generation dies off, maybe your descendants will be able to inherit the promised land. So Kadesh seems to be a major point on this road. The final third is what's unfolded over these past 39 years. Kadesh to the steppes of Moab, the material that's occupied our time for these many months. Okay, all the events of the wilderness. So these are the 3 units that that Milgrom sees: from the Exodus to Mount Sinai, from Mount Sinai to the spies, and from the spies to the end of the wilderness wanderings. And for those who love maps like me, the JPS Torah commentary provides some of this. I know that this map's got a lot of details on it, and it could just be not necessarily very helpful. But the reason why I put up this visual is to say, all all the place names in this chapter are of all the place names in this chapter, some of them are actually identifiable known sites that archaeologists have even excavated. Others are obscure, that no one really knows precisely where they are. And some of the place names in this chapter appear nowhere else in the Bible except for in this chapter. So this is one cartographer's best effort at mapping out Israel's wanderings through the wilderness. For our purposes here, here's Kadesh, which is also known as Kadesh Barnea. This is the place where the spies set out. After the spies returned back and God said, 40 years, you're condemned to the wilderness, then scholars debate. There's one point of view that says the way goes down south and skirts up around this way, and another point of view takes the route this way. I don't know how to resolve these questions, but I like looking at maps sometimes when I have nothing else to do. Okay, so that's the introduction. I'm going to put into the chat now a link to a source sheet that we'll study together that will make this hopefully a whole lot more meaningful and exciting. Because the obvious question that Jewish tradition takes up when we read a chapter like this, again, I'll just put it on the screen for a moment. When we get this reading of they set out from there, they set out from Ramses and encamped at Sukkot. They set out from Sukkot and encamped at Etam. Then it really gets going, further down. They set out from Hatzerot and encamped at Ritma. They set out from Ritma and encamped at Rimon, etc. The obvious question is, in the Yiddish language, why is the Torah hocking us a chinik with all of this? Why do we need all this detailed information? Especially because we've been reading, we read the book of Exodus, and we've read all of Numbers up until this point. We know all this. Why all of this review? The chapters set out in this very formulaic way, obviously, with this pattern of Vayisu, they set out, and Vayachanu, they encamped. 42 different stations over the course of 40 years. Maybe 42 is a magic number or something that somebody can connect with. If you read science fiction or Douglas Adams, you know that 42 is the secret to life, the universe, and everything, by the way. That's The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. But the Torah is older than that. I don't know if they were on the same wavelength. 42 way stations on the way between Exodus and arrival. Why do we need all of this? Well, one point of view that we're going to see is maybe this is like when you return home after a long trip somewhere. One of the things you do is you look at the photo album and you go through your memories and you recall all the travels along the way. Oh, remember when we made this stop? Oh, remember when we arrived at that place? Remember what adventures we had when we were there? Maybe that's the spirit in which this chapter is brought to us. But still, even that sort of review and nostalgia and looking backwards can be processed in different ways. It can be processed for better or for worse. In other words, let me ask this a different, maybe less convoluted way. You and I, my friends, are approaching the end of our weekly study of the book of Numbers. It's appropriate that we should look back. And when we look back, as we get here to the end of the book of Numbers of Bemidbar, what sort of taste is left in our mouths when we think about this book? Do we think about all the miracle stories? And this book is full of miraculous stories. The story of Bilam's talking donkey, the story of Miriam's well, which follows Israel through the desert and they drink from it every day and are nourished and survive. How about the manna, which fed us day in and day out in our adventures in the wilderness, or the pillar of cloud that led our way? Is that what we remember when we think about the book of Numbers? Some people. Or do we remember all the fetching and the complaining and the constant outright revolts and uprisings against Moses and Aaron and God, like the Korach rebellion or the events around Pinchas and his vigilante sort of justice, or the sin of the spies. I'm not asking for an answer for this. Maybe when we have our conclusion in a couple months' time that I'll ask you, but it's worth reflecting on. When you think about the book of Numbers, what kind of taste does it leave in your mouth? Miracles and wonders or complaints and revolts? Well, with that introduction, let's take a look at some of the commentaries who have things to say about exactly these sorts of questions. And the big question, why is the Torah at this point giving us all of this review and all of these names, all of these boring names, one after another? These were the marches of the Israelites. So, um, here's a couple of different points of view. Okay, I've talked up until this point, but I'll need a reader for some of these really fabulous texts that I'm excited to share with you. So can we have a volunteer to be our reader for today of the text I'm going to share on the screen? Paula Kaplan-Reese. Hi, Paula. Great. Thank you. So with that introduction, these are the questions that the first texts are going to take up. The text begins with Eila Maaseh B'nai Yisrael. These are the marches, the journeys, the travels of the Israelites through the desert. And how do we remember these? Why are we getting all these lists of names? Here's a couple of comments and points of view about what that might be. The first one is from Bemidbar Rabbah, the classic midrash on Bemidbar. Paula, go ahead.
The Holy and Blessed One said to Israel, during all those 40 years that you spent in the wilderness, there were enemies, snakes, fiery serpents, and scorpions, yet I did not let them harm you. As it is written, who led you through the great and terrible wilderness with its seraph, serpents, and scorpions, a parched land with no water in it, who brought forth water for you from the flinty rock. Therefore, God said to Moses, write down the stages by which Israel journeyed through the wilderness, so that they shall know all the miracles I performed for them.
Okay, this is a nice midrash, right? This is a very cheery and optimistic midrash. The answer to the question, how does this midrash reflect on the experiences of the book of Numbers? It's one miracle after another. And by recounting all of these places, it's God's way of saying, remember the miracle that I did for you here? And then remember the miracle I did for you in this place, and remember the miracle I did for you in this place. It's this very sunny sort of reflection about where we've been. Now, we can't quite let it leave at that because a little too much sunniness, you might say, doesn't feel too Jewish. In what's his name? Michael Wex has an amazing book about the Yiddish language, and which I recommend to anybody. It's a fantastic book called Born to Fetch, and it's about Yiddish and the Jewish worldview. And he has this great line where he says, "The Jewish way of looking at the world is viewing the world through cataract-colored glasses." So if you like to view the world through cataract colored glasses, here's the Midrash Tanchuma. Paula, will you give us this one too? It's much more concise.
The Holy and Blessed One said to Moses, spell out for them all the places where they angered me.
There you go. So there's the other view of why we got all the place names. Because you pissed me off when we were here, and you rebelled against me here, and you violated our covenant here, and that's what Numbers is all about. Which one is correct? Which one is our history? Both of them are our history. You know, our history is full of trials and tribulations, and our history is full of joys and exhilarations as well. But here we have two different lenses looking back on our history together. I think that's kind of cool. But now both of them are kind of simplistic. Now I'm going to give you some much richer interpretations, I think, from the tradition. And one place is to start with Maimonides. Maimonides, this is towards the concluding chapters of his masterpiece, The Guide to the Perplexed, where he's talking about, well, he's going to take up our question. Again, why is the Torah hock us with all of these different place names? But I will tell you that in this case, Maimonides is going to take the side of the Midrash and say this has everything to do with miracles. But it's not quite the same view of miracles that the Midrash says. The Midrash just said, it's like looking at vacation pictures and saying, remember what a wonderful trip that was that we were on together? Maimonides has a little more sober view of the miracles than that. So, with that, Paula, would you take up here the Guide of the Perplexed for us?
Sure, sometimes the Torah sets things down in writing that a person may consider too long or repetitive. However, if a person pays close attention to what is being narrated, we will understand the necessity of, I just lost it,
Oh,
of why it is being recounted. Thus, I know I had to make it bigger. That's why I needed to. Okay.
oh, I'm sorry.
Thus, when you see narratives of the Torah that do not belong to the law and seem unnecessary to have been set down, or which seem too long or repetitive, the reason is that you have not seen the particulars that necessitated, that the story be told in this manner. For instance, the travels of Israel in the wilderness. On the surface, this enumeration seems useless,
Yeah, he
but in
doesn't pull any
fact,
punches there, right? He doesn't pull any punches when he says, on the surface, this long list of 49 verses seems totally pointless, useless to us, right? But there's always a but. Go ahead.
but in fact, the need for this was very great. For all the miracles are certain from the perspective of those who have seen them, but in a future time their story becomes a mere traditional narrative, and the hearer might doubt they were even true. It is well known that it is impossible and inconceivable that a miracle endures permanently through the succession of generations, so that everyone can see it. Now, God knew that in the future, what happens to traditional narratives would happen to these miracles that Israel experienced in the wilderness. People would think that Israel traveled in a desert that was near cultivated and livable land, like the deserts inhabited at present by Arab groups, or that it consisted of places in which it was possible to till and to reap or to eat plants that were found there, or that it was totally natural for the manna to come down in those places or that there were wells of water in all those places. Therefore, for all these ideas are rebutted, and the miracles are confirmed through the enumeration of all those way stations, so that people would come and see how great was the miracle constituted by the sojourn of human beings in those places for 40 years.
Okay, so I need anybody to help unpack this. What did he say in our own words? Again, just think about it for a second. Look over it again. He's taking the side of the Midrash that says these were written down to enumerate the miracles that happened. But why do we need to enumerate all the miracles that happened from Maimonides' point of view? I think there's a profound spiritual insight here, or psychological insight. Take a look at these.
Because it was truly a desert, because there was nothing there, unlike how it is today.
Okay, that's a good start. Take a look at this paragraph in particular. Look at this second to last paragraph closely, and saying what's he saying about the purpose of writing down the itinerary where all these miracles happened for us in our past. Carol.
Well, I think it's like playing the game of telephone. You focus on the first thing you hear and the last thing you hear and nothing in the middle.
Mhm.
So over time, we would focus on where we started from, where we ended up, and the story in the middle, what we went through, would phase out or get transmitted differently or retold differently. Um, I think for me, this book is sort of the story of life. It's the journey that is life. And life has bumps in it, life has stumbling blocks in it. And all of these stops were stumbling blocks that we got over, and then Lech Lecha continued. So
Mm,
that's what that means to me.
what a beautiful answer that is. Thank you. Ronnie, don't forget to unmute yourself, Ronnie.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I'm very much taken of the concern of what happens to the history of the miracles or what happens to the history of in general through generations. He's looking back, but he's looking forward, and he's saying that if these are not recorded, then they're going to be lost forever because they get watered down from generation to generation.
I think that's great. I think you said that very beautifully and concisely. Thank you. I think that paragraph that I have highlighted on the screen there by the Rambam is really interesting. That he says miracles kind of last for the duration of the people who have experienced them. But once they're consigned to the past or they become somebody else's story, they tend to get glossed over. People don't really believe them. You might have some antagonists who say, oh, the beautiful things in your history, they're all lies anyway. Or maybe your own descendants will say, yeah, that was good for our ancestors, but that was in the distant past. You know, they've lost some of their power or some of their awe. But by writing them down and recounting the story, Rambam says, don't lose the awe and excitement of our own history that we've shared together. That's kind of what I get out of this. I love this passage where it says, in a future time, their story becomes a mere traditional, in quotes, because it's sort of cynical. It just becomes tradition, but the hearer might doubt that any of this was even true. God says to Moses, write this down as a testimony to the amazing things that have happened to us so that others, including the next generation, will actually know that our history is rather sublime and remarkable. That seems like a very Jewish mandate to me somehow. Okay, so that's Rambam. But I think the real hero of the interpreters here is Rashi. So I'm going to move on to Rashi's commentary. Rashi, I think he says some really marvelous things, offers us at least two beautiful midrashim about God's relationship to Israel. And if you have a sense that I've arranged these on the page, moving from the kind of straightforward emotional to something a little bit more complex and more spiritual, that's exactly what I tried to do. So Rashi's next. He offers some beautiful midrashim, and it's all about relationship between us and God. Again, the question is, why is the Torah giving us all of this detail, listing every one of the 42 way stations by name? And here comes Rashi's answer. It's really quite beautiful, I think. He offers two, so let's take them one at a time. The first one, Paula, will you keep reading? I've divided them into two paragraphs on the page. So here's the first one.
Sure.
Ele Maseh B'nai Yisrael. These are the marches of the Israelites.
Okay, these were the marches. Why were these journeys written down? In order to make known God's acts of living kindness, as said. For although God moved them about and caused them to wander in the wilderness, you shouldn't conclude that they were constantly on the move for 40 years without rest. For there are only 42 journeys listed here. Subtract 14, all of which took place in the first year, before the decree that they would spend 40 years in the desert. From Ramses to Rizmah, from where the spies were sent out, you can deduce that Rizmah was in the desert of Paran. And subtract too the 8 journeys which took place after Aaron's death from Mount Hor to the plains of Moab during the 40th years. It turns out that during the 38 years of wandering, they took only 20 journeys. This teaching is from the commentary of Rabbi Moshe HaDarshan. Rabbi
Okay, let's stop there for a
Tanhuma.
second.
Okay.
What did you say, Paula? What was the last thing you said?
No, go ahead.
Oh,
You told me to stop.
okay. So let's stop there for a second. And Rashi, as Rashi always does, Rashi's a masterfully close reader of the Torah. If you've been reading Bemidbar out loud like we have, or if you've been reading in the synagogue over the course of the summer months, you might get the sense that for 40 years, people were constantly on the move. that doesn't sound so great to me. Listen, I gotta add a little detail about my personal life. We're in the process of moving our house. We've lived in this house for 21 years. Nothing radical. Debbie, we're not coming back to New Jersey to live near you or anything like that, but we're moving closer to Boston. It's in a process. It'll take place over the course of the next few months. But it, I hate moving. It's awful. We've lived here for 21 years. We've got 21 years of stuff in our basement and in our closets and things like that. It is awful. So Rashi says, if you have the sense from Bemidbar that they were constantly moving, read it a little more closely. He says, actually, in that first year, they moved constantly. Yeah, that makes sense because they were trying to put as much distance between them and Egypt as possible. And in the last year, they were moving constantly. In the last 2 years after the death of Aaron to the arrival at this place, maybe that's because, I don't know, there was a sense that the journey was coming to an end. But in between the 38 years, he said, during 38 years of wandering, they only moved 20 times. Hey, listen, to me who's going through this, that still sounds like a lot. But Rashi comes along to say, if you have in this image in your mind of constantly moving with no rootedness whatsoever, not exactly. God was a little bit more beneficent than that. I don't know. I like that reading. And it's a reminder the word is chesed. God's chesed is you weren't constantly schlepping all the time. You had the opportunity to stop and breathe and get a sense of yourself and your family and your place before the journey moved again. In 38 years, it wasn't so much. That's Rashi's comment. I think I like his second comment even more because it's just so sweet. So, Paula, give us one more. Rabbi Tanhuma.
Okay. Rabbi Tanhuma explains it differently. This can be compared to a king whose son was sick, and the father brought him to a distant place for treatment. When they returned, the father began to list to his son all the stages of their journey. He said, here we slept, here we were cold, and here you had a headache, and so on.
Okay, that's a pretty concise comment. And it certainly anthropomorphizes God a lot, but in a way that really touches me, I think. There's something so sweet about this comment. There was a father and a son, and the son was very sick and had to go to a distant place for treatment. And and presumably the son recovered because of this treatment. And then as they returned, the father says to the son, let me remind you of all these places we went. Here, we stopped at this place when we were hungry, and we stopped at this place when we were tired. We stopped at this place when we were cold, and so on. And it's sort of recounting where we've been, even the trials that we experienced, in a sort of nostalgic way. We're recalling where we've been to arrive at this place of healing where we are now. I think there's something really beautiful about Rashi's comment. I'd like to hear your response to both of these, but I have a very particular question, though, about this last one. I like the last one, but I'm not sure I understand it. Because I guess the question is, he makes this analogy between the Father, who obviously is God in this analogy, and the Son, who's obviously Israel in this analogy. But in what way was the Son sick? You
Well,
got
you
my,
assume it's physically, it's not mentally, right?
oh, I don't know. I mean, it's a parable, so I don't know.
But
But
you
in what
going
way?
distant for treatment, I mean, it makes
Oh,
one
oh,
think of like a
no,
special
you
doctor.
understand what the this is, but it's a parable for something. And that's
Right.
what I'm trying to unpack at. In what way, in the parable, in what way is the son sick? Gershom, do you understand my question? I think you do.
We'll find out in a moment.
Okay.
So, when one is sick, it means uh, something in your normal condition is absent, modified, whatever. In this case, Israel was absent from its homeland, from the place where we belong, the place where we were destined to be. That seems very comparable to sickness to me.
So in your analogy, so maybe Egypt was the sickness, and it takes 40 years to recover from Egypt and from slavery and from bondage, right? That's
A
a
major component of it, yes, but even the wandering is still, we haven't quite gotten there yet. We haven't quite gotten better.
nice. Thank you. Um, Renata. Hi, Renata.
I think somewhat the same thing. I think it's analogous to I lost my thread of thought. Um, the journey is analogous to being sick and getting well. When you're sick, they were slaves in Egypt. They didn't know how to do anything except do what the master told them to do. They had to learn how to do everything. So each step along the way was one part of learning how to take care of yourself, how to be a mensch, how to be a person, how to act like an Israelite. And each step along all the long journey they took in the desert was what helped transform them from slaves into free people, into acting the world like free people, something like that.
I like that, and I think you're anticipating where I'm going to go with this next, and that is, what kind of journey is this anyway that we've been on?
But it's
But
a journey from
okay,
slavery to freedom. That's what it is. It's a
okay,
journey from
great,
slavery to freedom.
great. Thanks, Renata. Ronnie.
I think the sickness is slave mentality. I think that they had to uh, learn how to be. I don't know what the opposite of a slave mentality, but they had to um, become uh, aware of themselves as people who are not enslaved.
Yeah, what does it mean? What does freedom really mean? You know, freedom's a subtle idea in Jewish thought. Freedom incorporates responsibilities, um, gratitude, generosity, all sorts of other things come with freedom that a slave doesn't have to worry about. Thanks for that, Ronnie. I like that. And Carol.
I think at one level or another, and I agree with everything that's been said, these are all stories of maturation. They're
Yeah,
all stories of time. It reminds me of the process that a young girl or boy or any child goes through to become bar bat mitzvah, the mitzvah, whatever you want to call it, or the study that a convert does before they actually convert. We're learning and preparing to get to the next phase of our life.
mm,
And it's an education. And by going through each of the steps, we're remembering what we learned and why we learned it. So it's sort of like, in third grade you did this, in fourth grade you did this, and now you're graduating. Now you're ready to graduate and move on. Um,
lovely.
so so I agree. I mean, and for the Israelites, it's the story of the first generation dying off and the second generation preparing to move on. But for all of us, these are very personal and independent journeys. We all have our own versions of them.
Great. Thank you. Cheryl.
Maybe this is too simplistic, but given that it's the time of the year, I'm thinking of planting, and they're going through all these different environments, and they're unsettled in every place, and they have to tolerate all these different conditions until they finally get to Israel and can put down their roots.
Nice. Beautiful. Thank you. Bruce.
Yeah, I agree with everything, but I'd like to add something else.
Please.
We know why we're going to the promised land. We know what we're supposed to do. It's not about freedom. We're supposed to be servants of God. Okay? We're called to a purpose, and it's not just freedom. And we're not ready for it. We're not psychologically ready. That's the sickness we suffer from. I had an interesting conversation this week with a young friend of one of my kids who's not Jewish, but very thoughtful. I was kind of trying to explain why, as I understand it, in Judaism, when you're extremely ill, you can't serve you. It's very difficult to serve God. Okay. It's why we have such an emphasis on physical and mental healing, because then you're capable of doing it, or at least you can try. But in cases, and this whole discussion was about assisted suicide, that when you're totally incapable of serving God in any way possible, we can look not favorably, but we can understand that you're not in the right position, and maybe there is no right position for you. I don't want to take us down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, that's pretty heavy, but
If you want
but
to,
I
you do
appreciate
it. I
that.
don't want to. That's
Well,
enough
it's
of
pretty
me for
heavy, but
now.
I do like a lot of what you said about I mean, Rashi introduced the idea of illness and recovery. So let's hope that the end of the road is recovery, and with recovery comes the ability to serve God once again with all of one's heart and soul. Um, and with appreciation and gratitude, which maybe you didn't have at the beginning of the journey. I like that. I can relate to all of that. Okay, so the last couple of comments too of Ronnie's and Bruce's and Carol's um, have and Cheryl's have pushed us towards, I think, a sense of it's a different sort of plane, a psychological plane or even a spiritual plane for which this story unfolds. And of course, we have commentaries that address it that way as well. The final comment on this verse that I wanted to share is a Hasidic comment by a Polish rabbi from the middle of the 19th century. For those who enjoy Hasidic thought, he was one of the figures among the Hasidim of a place called Ger, the Gerer Hasidim. The Rebbe's name is Rebbe Pinchas of Dinovich in Poland. His book is called Siftei Tzadikim, and he has a nice comment about this. Again, the question that he's answering is what kind of journey was this anyway, this journey through the wilderness? And the Torah has given us 42 stops along the way in which we stopped, we journeyed, we encamped, and then we departed. We journeyed, we encamped, and we departed over and over again. 42 times, the Torah tells us. Why? And here comes the commentary of the Siftei Tzadikim. Is it on the screen right now? It is.
Yes.
Okay. Here's his comment. Haolam hazeh nikra olam hatikun. Oh, that's a great sentence. This world is called the world of tikkun. We like this word tikkun. Those who talk about tikkun olam and stuff. But in this sense, calling this the olam hatikun means we live in a world that is in desperate need of repair. That's why we call it this world. Each day, he's going to juxtapose it to say the world that the angels inhabit. But each day, a person needs to refine that which she or he did yesterday. Angels don't have to worry about this stuff. They're referred to as omdim, standing still, because they always remain on the same spiritual plane and have no ability nor need to repair or refine the past. But human beings, we move from one spiritual level to another throughout our lives. Thus, Ele Maseh B'nai Yisrael, these were the journeys of the Israelites, as if to say, each time the text says they encamped here or they set out from there, it means they were refining past events and moving from one spiritual level to another. Now, at this point, I should say, okay, everybody break up into small groups and discuss. Because that's a powerful paragraph, I think. He suggests that all of this, not just this chapter, but all of Bemidbar that we've been studying, is meant to be read not literally, but as a spiritual journey. And you take your past experiences, whether they were joyful or whether they were traumatic or they were painful, and you refine them and you integrate them into who you are now. Why? In order to be able to face the future with more confidence and growth. Somebody said, or I think it was Carol said earlier, this is all about, your word was maturation, right, Carol? I'd say it's all about growth. This is a journey of growth from one step to another that when you're in the midst of it, you don't really recognize it, but only in retrospect, when you look back, you say, my God, what a distance I've traveled in order to get to this place where I am now. Not a physical distance, a um, a developmental difference, a distance. What a journey I've been on, what a distance I've traveled in order to become the person who I am now. I think that that's what the Hasidic Rebbe here is talking about. He says, refining, again, I like the last line best, refining past events and moving from one spiritual level to another. That's what it means to live in this world of tikkun. That's a powerful paragraph. I'll bet you've got stuff to say about it. Marcia.
Okay. Um, I also agree with that, but I think in terms of each step, some of us, not all of us, some of us will learn compassion, humility, gratitude, because we're experiencing pain and and removal of pain. So stopping along the way makes us think about all the things we need to grow and become a better individual and a better people.
Beautifully said, Marcia. Thank you. Uh, David. And David, it was nice to see you at Hebrew College last night.
Very nice to see you and Dalvin with you. So, I'm just curious on this litany of places, why Har Sinai doesn't like stand out. I mean, that was a transformative thing. If you're talking about journeys and growing and developing, being given halakha, being given, an experience like that
Yeah.
would seem to play into it. And it's just, they just go right through it as if nothing happened there.
They don't even mention the mountain by name. They say the wilderness of Sinai.
Right,
And
right,
they didn't even say the wilderness of Sinai. I think they said the wilderness of Sin. Um,
right,
let me
right. Because
oh,
they had the Mishkan, they had the Torah. Um, how did that change their journey? How was it influencing them? It's kind of silent on all that.
it's so awesome. These two verses. They set out from the Sea of Reeds. They encamped in the wilderness of Sin. They set out from the wilderness of Sin and encamped at Dovka. We would have met, wait a minute, didn't something significant happen at that place? You know, where God gave us the Torah at Mount Sinai. Can you answer your own question, David? Why do you think that's downplayed here? You know, you may have also noticed that's also not mentioned in the Passover Haggadah either. The Passover story, when we do it, it doesn't stop and dwell on Mount Sinai. It kind of emphasizes the Exodus part, but not the arrival at Sinai part.
Yeah,
What? You want to take a stab at answering your own question?
I'll take a stab and hope not to kill it.
Ah,
I think that um, I had the thought. Your journey um, is both inward and outward, and every day is a revelation. Every day is a new creation. So, in some ways, it's not like there was one point in time where everything changed. It's always changing and it's always recreating. So, maybe we don't emphasize a event that may or may not happen in the desert as much as what happens every day.
very nice. That's a beautiful answer. Um, Carol, do you want to? Are you responding to David's question?
Just a quick thought. In the desert, we would hear the shofar. We'd blow shofar every time it was time to pack up from camp and start moving.
Yeah.
And then we'd hear shofar again when it was time to stop moving and set up camp and set up the tabernacle. And in the desert, you didn't hear the shofar every day. But as we read through this list of the 40 or 38 places we've been to, 42 places we've been to, all I kept hearing was the shofar blasts every time we left one and got to another and left one and got to another. And it occurred to me that each one of those is like a high holy day, a Yom Kippur. And each step in our journey was a clean slate and a new journey to be good people and to live by the mitzvot. and each step was an atonement. I mean, all of that sort of levels of learning and maturing and all of that. But in this passage, they all happened really quickly, and all I could hear are tons of shofar blasts.
Um, I hope you give that Devar Torah in your shul when this Torah portion comes around. And if you do, send me a copy of it. Great. You know, I'll be thinking about your question, David, about why is Sinai not a big deal in this chapter. I think it has something to do with that would distract from the destination. And I think that has something to do with why it's missing from the Haggadah on Passover also. And and for that matter, Sinai itself is sort of a mystery. I know that there's a place in Egypt where you can go visit that calls itself Mount Sinai. I've been there before myself. It's an awesome place to go visit. Um, I highly recommend it. You have to drive through the desert to get to that place, and you usually climb the mountain at night and watch the sunrise come from it. That's what I did years ago when I went to Mount Sinai. And it certainly looks the part, except that no historian will tell you that this is authentically Mount Sinai. It's sort of the real Mount Sinai is never identified as a place by historians or archaeologists. It's almost like the Bible deliberately covers it up because Sinai is hugely important in our spiritual history, of course, but it's not Jerusalem and it's not Israel. We have one promised land um, in Jewish tradition. And that's also why the site where Moses is buried is sort of, it's named, but it's also sort of obscure, also, um, the tradition says. So that wouldn't become a pilgrimage site because we have a pilgrimage site, and that's supposed to be Jerusalem. So maybe there's at this point in the story, a willful obscuring of Sinai because the emphasis in this story is the destination of the promised land. Maybe there were some people who, when at Mount Sinai, said, "We don't want to leave here. This is the place we want to stay, where God speaks to us." And the message of that story is, no, no, no. Your journey's not done yet. You've still got a whole lot more living to do and a whole lot more of a destination to arrive at. And that's Eretz Yisrael. That's the best semi-spiritual, semi-Zionist answer that I can give you. But I'll keep thinking about that. David, you want to respond to that? Does that work for you at all? No, David?
I'll give it some more thought.
Okay, that's the best I can do with your really smart answer. Ronnie, you have another comment on this before we're all done?
Yeah, I think that it has
Mhm.
nothing to do with physical growth or the places that you've been to. I think it's I think it's about your spiritual growth,
Yeah,
and that your spiritual growth is the most important growth. And that's why we have to dedicate every day to that part of our makeup that will lead us along the way. And I'm almost curious, will our spiritual growth bring us up to angels, or is that the goal? Um, but again, I don't think this has anything to do with the physical learning or accepting or going to places. I think it's just concerned with an individual's spiritual journey.
great. And that brings us back to the Hasidic statement that says exactly that you said beautifully, that that's what's going on here as well. That human beings, not angels, are constantly moving the spiritual levels on which we live, and that's the journey of life and the journey of growth. Renata, one more comment.
Yes,
And then I'm going to wrap
the
up with
Torah is
something.
actually telling us two different things, taking on a spiritual journey and taking on an actual journey. So the Torah is doing many things. It's telling us how we began and it's telling us how we want to, how we think about the world and how we think who we are. They're two different, actually two different stories that are kind of interwoven in the whole Torah. Part of it is physically explaining the world and where we are. Another is a spiritual journey taking us from being slaves, not to understanding what to being a free people. Something like they're two different. I see two different journeys here. They're not the same. Either in the same book, but they're not the same.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. I just got 1 or 2 minutes left, and I want to show you one or two other well, 1 or 2 other things I put on the source sheet for us here that I hope will be meaningful for you. So we've followed this journey, and once again, I know this is a little bit redundant, but I've made this observation lots of times over the last few months. When you get a passage of the Torah that seems very dry and very clinical, suddenly, you go to our sources and they find all sorts of incredible insights for our own lives here. I think that that's what the Midrash and Rashi and the Hasidic commentary have done here. I hope you agree. There's a couple other commentaries on the page here that we won't get to today. There's a strange phrasing in the second verse about departures and arrivals. The second verse seems to say Moses recorded the starting points or the going out places for their marches and the marches according to their going out places. It doesn't make much sense in English. It also is a little convoluted in Hebrew too. But that leads to two comments that I've put on the page here from two very different contemporary people. One is Rabbi Riskin, who is a rabbi in Efrat in the West Bank, who has a lovely commentary here about Jews. He says, who speaks about Jews traveling backwards, going a journey forward is trying to reconnect with your ancient source. And he finds that in that language. The other comment I have here is my old friend, Cantor Ellen Dreskin, um, in Westchester County, New York, who has also a beautiful interpretation of this, who sort of says the opposite of Rabbi Riskin about how progress is always kind of leaving something behind and going to the next chapter of your life and the next generation. But she points out something else really interesting too, which sounds like Rashi. The reason why all of this is recorded in the Torah is because when you're in the middle of your adventures, when you're in the middle of your life's experiences, whether they're joyful ones or they're painful ones, you usually don't have the time to stop and reflect on how am I growing for this, or what does this mean for my spiritual development? That's only in retrospect. Only when you look back and you say, that was such a joyful moment in my life, or that was a really painful time for me. Only in retrospect do you get to really say, do you get to integrate it into your soul and say, I'm a different person because of those things. In other words, she says the key part of this verse is Moses wrote it down. Because by writing it down, she says, what turns documentation into Torah is the nature of this dual perspective of this verse. Growing is also, in retrospect, realizing where you've been. All right, I said I wasn't going to teach them, but that's that. You can read their comments in greater depth. Can I show you one whimsical thing before we're all done that has nothing to do with what we've talked about up until this point? But once in a while, before we're all done, I like to share with you really just kind of wild, insightful, fun sort of comments about the Torah. And I think this has been a fun class today for me. Um, when you look back at this long, long chapter, which is so full of words and names and the 42 places that Israel traveled during all this time, you'll never have noticed the thing that the next commentary is going to point out. The commentary is from another Hasidic master, one of the very early ones. He was a disciple of the Maggid of Mezrich, who was the second generation of Hasidic masters. His name was Rabbi Pinchas Zalman Halevi. In his book called Ahavas Torah, The Love of the Torah, he discovers something wild about this long chapter, 49 verses that we just investigated. He says, throughout this entire section describing the travels of the Israelites, the Hebrew letter Zion never appears. Now that's a wild thing to notice. After I read his comment, I went back and skimmed over the chapter, and I think he's right. There's one letter from the Hebrew alphabet that's missing in these 49 verses of the Torah. What a crazy thing to notice and to discover. But it's pointless unless there's a lesson to it. So, what's the lesson? He derives two. First, oh, so you have to know this. In Hebrew, the letters are also numbers. So, the letter Zion is what number? It's the number seven. Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Daled, Hey, Vav, Zion is the number seven. And you know that seven's a magic number in the Torah, right? It's a hint to us that the Israelite camp never moved on Shabbat, the seventh day, because the Hebrew letter Zion is seven. So I'm describing all the movements that you've done for 40 years from one place to another, but the letter Zion, the number seven, is missing from the whole account as a way to wink at you and say, but they didn't move on Shabbat. Isn't that great? Okay, if you don't like that one, I'll tell you another one. Zion is also a Hebrew word. Second, it's a hint that throughout their entire journey, the Israelites never needed a Zion, which is a weapon of war. So there have been some violent passages throughout Numbers. There certainly have, and there's at least one more yet to come in our studies together. But the Hasidim always remind us that anything that sounds like war in the Torah is an internal war, is a spiritual war, is the war against the Yetzer Hara. But lest you think that the Torah is condoning physical violence, he says, in the 42 years, in the 40 years and the 42 places we traveled through the wilderness, they never needed an actual Zion, an actual weapon of war to fight their enemies. So it should be with us. But unfortunately, we don't quite live in that world yet, but it's an aspiration. Thanks, everybody. Wonderful to be with you all today. Enjoy this beautiful afternoon, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks.
Great
Hope you
class.
enjoyed this
Thanks,
today.
Neil.